The spring of 1944 on the Eastern Front bore little resemblance to the images in propaganda posters. Mud, melting snow, overcrowded medical stations, constant rotation of frontline units and those moving into defensive positions. Deeper in the rear zone, in a small town close to the front, the headquarters of an Army Corps operated. Several surviving stone buildings, surrounded by ruins and half-burned wooden houses, housed operational departments, intelligence officers, communication units, and counterintelligence personnel. The headquarters functioned according to its own rhythm. During the day, reports arrived from the divisions. At night came clarifications, ammunition flow records, casualty lists, and requests for reinforcements. In one of the structures converted into work offices for the operational and intelligence sections, space was always in short supply. Folding beds stood in the corridors, improvised telephone lines ran along the walls, and documents in thick folders lay on windowsills. The counterintelligence detachment, formerly attached to the Army headquarters, occupied several rooms on the second floor. Here they gathered information about sabotage, desertion, and suspicious individuals appearing within the core zone. By this stage of the war, it was no longer possible to rely solely on uniforms and properly stamped papers. Enemy reconnaissance teams operated behind the lines, and prisoners sometimes arrived with carefully constructed legends. In early March, a new communications officer arrived from one of the subordinate divisions. According to the documents, he was a senior lieutenant transferred from an Army communications center to reinforce the headquarters. The paperwork showed no irregularities. His arrival had been processed correctly and included orders, signatures, and stamps. Outwardly, he was unremarkable. A typical frontline appearance, standard uniform, neatly filled service book. His competence was confirmed during his first duty shifts when he quickly understood the communication layout and helped resolve several signal disruptions. Counterintelligence acknowledged his arrival, recorded his data in the logs, and shifted focus to more urgent matters. At that time, enemy infiltration attempts into frontline settlements increased, and there were cases of information being passed through local civilians. All available resources were directed toward tracking sabotage groups and monitoring captured or evacuated individuals. 2 weeks after the communication officer reached the headquarters, a batch of delayed correspondence arrived from a nearby field post service. The postal system, strained beyond its limits, often dealt with lost or damaged letters that had gone to the wrong units. Some envelopes returned with notes stating that the addressee had been reassigned or that the unit had been disbanded. These items were forwarded to the headquarters, where duty personnel reviewed them and, if needed, passed them to counterintelligence. One envelope drew attention. It was a thick packet without a return address. The front bore an old field post marking and a nearly illegible number of a postal station. Inside were several small photographs. On the back of one was a faded inscription indicating the number of an infantry regiment and a date from 1942. The photographs were typical of wartime conditions. A group of officers and sergeants standing near a village shed, several shots beside captured equipment, portrait-like poses taken during a rest break. Nothing unusual, except for one detail. In 2 different photographs appeared a man who strongly resembled the communications officer who had recently arrived at the headquarters. In the first photograph, he stood in the second row among officers belonging to a large formation that, according to available records, had been nearly destroyed in an encirclement months later. In the second photograph, the same man appeared at a staff table covered with maps. There were no preserved captions. His face and posture were recognizable, though counterintelligence initially assumed the similarity could be coincidental. Procedure required the evaluation of even the weakest correlations. The photographs were placed in a separate file and compared with the personnel record of the communication officer. His official document stated that in 1942 he had served in a different communication unit positioned elsewhere on the front. There was no indication that he had ever been part of the regiment shown in the photograph. Such a discrepancy could be explained by incomplete paperwork, clerical error, or gaps in record-keeping during the chaotic early war period. However, under conditions of heightened surveillance for enemy infiltration, any inconsistency demanded careful examination. Counterintelligence officers reviewed the photographs again in daylight and compared them with recent visual observations of the man. The shape of the face, the posture, the angle of the head, the distinctive jawline all produced the impression of an almost exact match. At the same time, he appeared nearly the same age in the older photograph as he did now, only 2 years later. This might be normal coincidence, but prompted additional questions. No conclusions were made. A preliminary sheet of notes was added to the file. It included the date the envelope was received, the likely route of the letter, the approximate location where the photograph could have been taken, and all visible unit numbers on caps and collar tabs. Thus, an insignificant-looking piece of mail without address or signature became the starting point of a verification process. It would soon extend across several layers of the command structure and lead to discoveries that affected not only the fate of one individual, but also the perceived reliability of entire segments of the headquarters system. The initial review of the photographs did not produce immediate conclusions, yet the images continued to attract attention as more details emerged. Counterintelligence personnel began examining the packet more thoroughly, checking paper quality, postmarks, and the order in which the photos had likely been placed. Their work revealed that the envelope had probably traveled across several sectors during chaotic frontline shifts in 1942 and 1943, eventually being redirected through a mail station that no longer existed. The photographs themselves showed signs of age typical for field conditions. Scratches, creases, and stains suggested long-term storage in a pocket or bag. 2 images containing the suspected officer were especially significant. The building in the background of the group photo was identified as a structure belonging to a regiment that had fought far to the south of the area where the new communications officer claimed to have served. This geographical mismatch became the first major inconsistency. Counterintelligence compared the date written on the back of one photograph with the service timeline of the officer. According to his personnel file, he had been undergoing training in a rear communications school at the time the photo was taken. No record mentioned a temporary assignment or attachment to an infantry regiment. Normally, such omissions were rare because communication personnel required precise documentation of their postings. As additional checks were conducted, more irregularities surfaced. A review of unit rosters from 1942 revealed a name similar to his, but with different initials. The corresponding soldier was reported missing during the encirclement of that same regiment. It remained unclear whether this similarity was coincidence or evidence of a substituted identity. Counterintelligence requested access to archived records from multiple Army groups in order to compare the photograph with older personnel listings. Meanwhile, the officer continued performing his duties within the headquarters without showing any sign of concern. His knowledge of communication procedures, his conduct, and his discipline caused no suspicion. Several staff members even noted his usefulness in resolving signal delays. This contrast between reliable behavior and unclear background complicated the investigation, as counterintelligence avoided premature conclusions. To clarify the situation, specialists examined the uniform details visible on the photographs. Shoulder boards, collar tabs, and insignia matched the regiment indicated by the handwritten note. The image resolution was not ideal, yet specialists confirmed that the photographed officer did not appear to be wearing communication service insignia typical of the period. Instead, the uniform elements suggested affiliation with a frontline infantry staff. This contradiction deepened the uncertainty. If the officer in the headquarters was the same person as the one in the photographs, his documented service history was incomplete or incorrect. If he was not the same man, the resemblance was unusually strong. The possibility of an imposter infiltrating a headquarters, although unlikely, could not be dismissed entirely. Further investigation led counterintelligence to search for other surviving members of the regiment shown in the images. Most had been killed or captured. Only a small number had been reassigned before the encirclement. Requests were sent to rear hospitals, replacement battalions, and recovery units. Any surviving soldier who might have seen the photographed officer could help resolve the uncertainty. During this period, counterintelligence built a timeline covering the movements of the photographed regiment. They compared this timeline to the known work of enemy reconnaissance in the same regions. The possibility that enemy intelligence had obtained uniforms and documents from destroyed units was not new. Several previously identified imposters had used similar methods, taking advantage of the confusion caused by rapid changes in frontline positions. As the review continued, a pattern emerged. The inconsistencies in the officers' paperwork aligned precisely with the gaps that were most vulnerable to enemy manipulation during earlier phases of the war. Several identity checks performed in 1942 and early 1943 were incomplete due to field conditions. This alone did not prove infiltration, but it significantly reduced certainty in his background. Counterintelligence now faced a dilemma. There was still no definitive evidence that the officer was an imposter, yet the likelihood increased with each inconsistency found. Removing him from duty prematurely could disrupt headquarters work and undermine morale. Allowing him to continue without verification jeopardized security. The investigation continued quietly, with new cross-references and requests for old personnel logs. The lost photographs, once seemingly trivial, had become the central piece of a broader inquiry. What started as a minor anomaly was slowly evolving into a matter affecting both the trust and the internal stability of the headquarters staff. As the inquiry progressed, counterintelligence shifted from simple comparison work to constructing a broader analytical framework. The original envelope had already shown that even a misplaced set of photographs could reveal structural weaknesses in the wartime bureaucracy. Now the investigation began to expose connections that were not immediately obvious during the initial review. The first major development came from personnel archives. A delayed response from a rear administrative office contained fragments of service cards salvaged from a partially burned storage site. Among them was a damaged form listing a junior officer from the photographed regiment. The handwriting was faint, but the photograph attached to the form bore an unsettling resemblance to the officer serving in the headquarters. The listed status, however, indicated that this individual had been declared missing after the regiment's encirclement. This discovery significantly narrowed the margin for coincidence. Parallel to this, field reports finally arrived from a recovery battalion that had absorbed survivors from several destroyed units. None of the interviewed soldiers recognized the officer now working at the headquarters. Yet this absence of recognition did not eliminate suspicion. Many who had served closely with the lost regiment were no longer alive or had been hospitalized far from the core sector. Counterintelligence expanded the search to include abandoned medical stations and temporary aid points that had existed during the winter of 1942 and early 1943. Surviving logs revealed that several unidentified soldiers had passed through these locations, often lacking documents or wearing parts of uniforms from different units. This pattern was common for chaotic retreats. It also provided ideal circumstances for concealment or identity substitution. The next clue emerged from analysis of uniform details in the photographs. Specialists confirmed that the rank insignia in one image did not match the officer's current documented promotion timeline. The insignia worn in the 1942 photograph indicated a higher position than the one officially assigned to him during that period. If the photographed man was indeed the same individual, his official service history was incomplete or deliberately altered. Additional inconsistencies appeared in the communication officer's technical knowledge. Although he demonstrated strong practical skills, Several procedures he used belonged to earlier field protocols that had been discontinued by mid-1943. Staff members attributed this to habits formed in previous postings, yet counterintelligence considered the possibility that he had served in a different environment than the one described in his documents. Meanwhile, the investigation was carried out with extreme caution. Headquarters routines could not be disrupted, and suspicion could not leak into the wider staff. The communications officer remained unaware of the inquiry and continued performing duties without deviation. His discipline, punctuality, and calm demeanor made the situation more ambiguous. Nothing in his behavior suggested an imposter, yet the dossier built around him had grown increasingly inconsistent. Counterintelligence analysts assembled a detailed movement map, comparing the regiment's collapse, known enemy activities, and documented cases of identity loss or theft. Their studies showed that during intense engagements in 1942, several enemy reconnaissance groups had penetrated retreating Soviet positions. At least one had been reported operating in the proximity of the photographed regiment just days before it disappeared as an organized formation. This context amplified the significance of the recovered photographs. The images were no longer viewed as simple personal memorabilia, but as a potential evidence source in reconstructing a larger pattern of infiltration attempts. The envelope's arrival in the headquarters mail system, although likely accidental, had triggered a chain of questions that aligned with known enemy tactics. By late spring, the investigation reached a stage where counterintelligence could no longer rely solely on document analysis. They needed direct confirmation from the officer himself. Yet such a step required absolute precision. A misstep risked compromising the inquiry or provoking the reaction of someone who might be far more dangerous than he appeared. The team prepared a comprehensive summary for the Corps' security director, outlining all confirmed inconsistencies, the historical context of the photographs, and the probability estimates. Although the report avoided final conclusions, it clearly indicated that the situation could no longer be treated as an administrative anomaly. A formal verification process had become unavoidable. The decision was made to initiate the next stage of the investigation. Its outcome would determine whether the officer was a legitimate soldier with flawed documentation or an individual who had assumed a dead man's identity during the chaos of earlier campaigns. The final stage was approaching, and it promised to be decisive. The final stage of the investigation began with a review of all accumulated materials. Counterintelligence officers examined each document, photograph, and archival fragment to ensure that no detail had been overlooked. The file on the communications officer had grown into a substantial dossier. What had begun with a few inconsistent images now represented a fully structured inquiry into identity, service records, and the movement of entire units across multiple fronts. The first decisive step involved cross-referencing the officer's fingerprints. Although wartime procedures rarely relied on biometric verification, several rear hospitals had introduced limited fingerprint cataloging during early 1942. Records from one such hospital, located far from the current sector, were recovered after extensive searching. The prints on file belonged to a soldier with the same surname as the missing officer from the destroyed regiment. The initials partially matched but did not correspond to the newly arrived communications officer. This partial match created a contradiction that required further analysis. The next step concerned the origin of the photographs. After a careful study of the handwritten markings on the back of one image, specialists identified the likely area where the photograph had been taken. The location belonged to a region where an enemy reconnaissance operation had been confirmed shortly before the regiment was surrounded and destroyed. This timing aligned precisely with the moment when several soldiers had gone missing under unclear circumstances, including the officer whose face resembled the man now working in the headquarters. Counterintelligence then reconstructed the chain of movement for the envelope itself. The document showed that the packet had passed through at least 3 postal stations, each affected by frontline collapses or rapid relocations. The chaotic circulation of mail meant that the envelope could easily have mixed with belongings from abandoned field posts or from soldiers who never returned. While the origin of the photographs remained uncertain, their path through disrupted sectors suggested that they had survived by circumstance rather than intention. Attention shifted to the behavior of the communications officer during his service in the headquarters. Observational notes collected over weeks indicated that he demonstrated consistent discipline, technical competence, and stable routines. Yet within these patterns, analysts identified subtle inconsistencies. He avoided interacting with staff who had served in southern sectors where the regiment had once operated. He showed detailed familiarity with older field procedures that no longer matched the official timeline of his documented assignments. None of these behaviors were incriminating in isolation, but together they added weight to the hypothesis that his background differed from his paperwork. Counterintelligence prepared a structured interview plan designed not to raise suspicion. It focused on verifying service chronology, operational roles, and prior postings. The intention was not confrontation, but controlled evaluation. The interview took place within a routine administrative context inside a secure room. Observers monitored his responses and physical reactions. The results were inconclusive. He provided coherent explanations, yet some of his statements conflicted subtly with archived data. His description of early campaigns contained imprecise references that did not fully align with official operational histories. Following the interview, analysts reviewed all gathered evidence. The strongest point remained the photographs. Comparative analysis using facial proportion measurements indicated a high probability that the officer in the images and the communications officer were the same individual. However, without absolute confirmation, the findings remained in the realm of assessment rather than proof. A decision was made to trace the uniform worn by the officer in the 1942 photograph. Specialists identified unique stitching patterns and a partially visible number associated with a specific supply distribution point. Records confirmed that uniforms processed at that location were issued exclusively to the regiment depicted in the photograph. This finding provided the first direct link between the photographed officer and the destroyed formation. The investigation reached its final stage when counterintelligence obtained a personnel list from a rear archive that had been considered lost. Among the names was the soldier shown in the photograph. The service record stated that he had vanished during the retreat and had never rejoined any unit. The date of disappearance fell precisely within the period when several identity anomalies had occurred across the front. This discovery, combined with the facial analysis and uniform verification, created a coherent picture. Although the precise circumstances of the identity change could not be reconstructed, the probability that the communications officer had assumed the identity of a missing soldier was now overwhelming. Whether he had done so intentionally or as a consequence of battlefield confusion remained unclear, and wartime chaos had frequently produced similar cases. The final report described the officer as an individual with an undocumented period in his service history, likely caused by separation from his original unit and subsequent assimilation under another identity. Due to his demonstrated competence, stable conduct, and the absence of hostile activity, the case was classified as an administrative discrepancy rather than an infiltration attempt. The headquarters chose not to pursue punitive measures. Instead, his records were corrected to reflect the newly verified elements of his past. He remained in his position, continuing his duties without interruption. For the staff, the case became an example of the unpredictable consequences of frontline disintegration and the fluidity of identities during prolonged conflict. The photographs were archived with a detailed annotation describing the investigation. What began as a forgotten envelope found in a mail pile had revealed a complex story forged by the disarray of war. The images, once considered insignificant, had exposed the fragile boundaries between truth and documentation in an environment where survival often depended on circumstances rather than recorded history. The case closed quietly, leaving behind a reminder that in the vast machinery of wartime bureaucracy, even the smallest fragment of evidence could reshape the understanding of an entire individual's past.